the gospel is so important because it provides, we might say, missing piece or the antidote for instinctive knowledge that everyone has. You see, I believe that everyone in the world has an instinctive knowledge of God. I don't believe there are any atheists. I think there's a lot of people with big talk and a lot of bluster, but I don't really think there are any atheists. We were talking before the service about a man named Andrew Womack that I used to get tapes from him. I still could, but I just got them all, so I don't need to get his tapes. But he sent his tapes out free. When I first became a Christian, I found this man named Andrew Womack that would send out tapes for free, and I thought that was a great deal, so I would get a couple every week. And anyway, I heard him tell that he went to Vietnam when he was of that age, and he was a Christian, and he tried to organize Bible studies among the soldiers. And he ran into a lot of soldiers who said, "Oh, I don't want to come to your Bible study. I'm an atheist," and would give him a lot of intellectual reasons why there couldn't be a God and why there's no God. And they would talk rings around him because he didn't have a college education. They were all educated and smart, and they could prove to him intellectually why there was no God. But what he said was he noticed when the bombs started falling around them and the mortars started crashing right next to him, all those men who said they were atheists were calling on that God they didn't believe in. They were calling on that God to save them and help them. So I believe that everyone has an instinctive knowledge of God. Secondly, I believe everyone has an instinctive knowledge that God is holy and that He is righteous and that He is pure and that He's perfect. And along with that, there's a third element of this. Everyone also has an instinctive knowledge that just as there is a God and He's perfect and righteous and holy, that we ourselves as individuals are not, that we fall short in some respect. Now, we could look around at one another and compare ourselves to one another and say, well, maybe I don't fall as short as that guy does, but everybody knows that they're not as holy as God and they're not as righteous as God. So Paul and other writers in the New Testament, when they convey to us the gospel, they provide to us, see, all that is true. That is not false. And none of that instinctive knowledge, and by the way, that instinctive knowledge came from Adam from the beginning. When Adam ate of that tree that God told him not to eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he gained all of that as instinctive knowledge, and that all was handed down to all of us. But the gospel provides something that's missing from that instinctive knowledge. And I'd like to give that to you from chapter 2 of Ephesians this morning, and talk to you about God's amazing grace. I heard, have any of you ever heard of Joseph Prince? Have you ever heard of him? Do you know who that is? He has a very large church in, I believe it's Singapore, and thousands of members. And I heard him say that God spoke to him and told him, unless you preach grace in a radical way, people's lives will not be radically changed. I guess I think what he said was in an extreme way. Unless you preach grace in an extreme way, people's lives will not be changed in an extreme way. So I'd like to talk to you today about God's amazing grace. I thought that was a good thought, by the way. In Ephesians chapter 2, in verse 1, Paul says this. I'm reading from the King James translation. "And you hath He quickened, who were dead in trespasses and sins." On the screen here, in the brackets, there are some words, "hath He quickened." In the King James translation of the Bible, it's italicized. Whenever you see italics, and that's represented by the brackets here, whenever you see italics in your King James Bible, those are words that have been added by the translators. The King James translation is a good, word-for-word, honest translation of the Bible. And the translators, whenever they added words that they thought would help to convey the meaning, they were honest enough to put those words in italics so that you could see that they had added those words. So if we leave out the words that are added, he's just addressing you, and he says, "And you who were dead in trespasses and sins." Now, he's not writing to sinners. He's not writing to people who are not Christians. He's writing to the church, to the saints, the believers that are at Ephesus. And by extension, we who are reading over their shoulders, we could say he's writing to us. He's writing to Christians, or people just like us. But he writes to Christians, or to people just like us, and he wants to, first of all, remind us that we were, before Jesus, we were, in relation to God, dead in trespasses and sins. So he's talking to us, and he wants to call our attention to a time before we knew Christ. And he says, you were. He wants to remind us of this, and he's going to use that to make a good point. You, and that means you and me, we were dead in trespasses and sins. And in verse 2, he begins to explain what that means. Wherein, in times past, you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. He says, in times past in your life, you walked according to the course of the world. He wants to remind us of that. He says, in times past, you walked according to the prince of the power of the air. meaning the devil. The spirit, he says, that now works in the children of disobedience. Children of disobedience means people who are the offspring of Adam. Adam was the one who was disobedient. Paul tells us in in Romans chapter 5 that by one man's disobedience many were made sinners. See, Adam is the one who was disobedient in the beginning, and all of his offspring carried that nature along with him. But the good news with that is he goes on in Romans 5 and says, by one man's obedience many are made righteous. And so just like one man messed it up, another one man, Jesus, came and made it all right. But Paul is reminding us of the fact that we, before Christ, were separate from God. We were dead in trespasses and sins, children of disobedience. This is a very dark picture he's painting here. In verse 3 he says, among whom also we all. You notice how he keeps saying all of us. He puts us all in the same boat here. Among whom also we all had our conversation in times past. Now just a moment ago I said I like the King James translation. Now there are some things that are problems in the King James, and that is because it was written 400 years ago. They use a lot of words that we don't use or expressions we don't use. One of them is this word conversation. He says, we all had our conversation. Now we use conversation meaning the way we talk with one another. But in the days of King James when this was translated, the word conversation could also mean our manner of life or the way we lived in relation to one another. That's what conversation meant, the way we walk or live as it relates to one another, the way we relate to one another. And he says, we all had a manner of life in times past. And here, listen to these words now. In the lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as others. Now first he said children of disobedience and children of wrath. Whenever you see the word wrath in the King James Bible, in the New Testament, it always means the penalty for wrongdoing. It never means God is an emotional basket case. It doesn't mean that God is so angry and he just lost control and he kicked the trash can over or something like that. It means, see, God is not emotional at all. Wrath means, when Paul uses it, he always means the penalty for wrongdoing. In fact, he talks about in Romans chapter 13 that Christians should obey the laws of the land in which we live. He says not only for wrath's sake, but for conscience. And if you look it up in other translations, you find out what he means is not only because you get punished, but for conscience sake. In other words, if I go out here and drive 100 miles an hour down the Oklahoma Boulevard, they're going to pull me over, and then when they throw me into jail, that is the wrath or the punishment, you see. And so when Paul says you're children of wrath, even as others, he means because we're children of Adam, we deserve God's punishment. So he's wanting to hem us all in and fence us all in and say, remember that before Jesus, you were just like everybody else in the world. And look at all these words here. I mean, lust of the all this ugly language. Lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and by nature children deserving of punishment, children of wrath, even as others. Now, what we would expect, you see, we know this. This is part of that instinctive knowledge. Everybody already knows this, by the way. Paul is reminding us of something that everybody in the world knows this. You see, people out here walking around that are not in church, that don't go to church, they have an instinctive knowledge that there's a holy, righteous God. And they have an instinctive knowledge that they are children of wrath, even as others. I mean, you can even catch people in their conversation making reference. You know, I was at Walmart one day, just minding my own business. And by the way, I'm not like Merlin Booty. I don't preach when I go to Walmart. You know, I just go to shop and buy my groceries and go home. But I hear things. You know, I was passing, where they have the bananas there. They're all stacked up on that thing. And I'm a little short guy. And, I was passing the bananas. And I heard somebody on the other side. I couldn't see them because the bananas were so tall. But I'm pushing my basket past the bananas. And I heard somebody going the other way. And I just had, they weren't talking to me. I just heard this little conversation. This person says, if I don't change my ways, I'm going to hell. Well, they weren't talking to me, and I don't know what kind of conversation they were having. I shudder to think what they might have been talking about, but they told me they had an instinctive knowledge that there is a righteous God and that they're not righteous and they deserve God's punishment. So far, everything Paul has said is instinctive. Now here's where it gets interesting. What we think after reading about what did we just read here? The lust of the flesh and the desires of the flesh and of the mind and children of wrath. What we expect to read next is, and God is really angry. And he's headed up to here. And smoke's coming out of his ears. And he's drumming his fingers on the table. And he's patting his foot. And he's saying, I'll tell you what, I can't take another minute of it. And they're going to get what's coming to them. Now, we expect to read that. We expect to see God respond that way. Because, frankly, that would be justice. Would it not? That would be just for God to give us what was coming to us. But it's been mentioned already this morning. God is not just righteous and just. He's also love. He's full of love.